All right, well, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. I'm going to ask us to open up to page 564 in the Red Humashim. And my question for today, we have been speaking a great deal about the Mishkan, about the tabernacle. As a matter of fact, if you collect all of the different places in the book of Exodus that we talk in detail about the Mishkan, it's actually one of the longer sections of our Torah. If you put all of that together, it takes up a lot of space in our Torah, and we know that things that take up space in our Torah, those are important things. So the question is, why is this Mishkan so important, and what is the purpose? What is the ultimate purpose of the Mishkan? We've talked about the Mishkan in terms of how it should be, how we should decorate it, the intentionality that we should have behind it in building it, but we haven't actually talked about why is it there.
Well, it's probably a simple answer. It's probably has to do with the words "Va'asuli Mishkan v'shachanti b'tocham." So God commanded Va'asuli, and we have those words on our.
Right, Vasili Mikdash actually, just to be correct, but it's still the same thing. Make for me a sanctuary and I will,
V'shachanti.
right,
Mishkan, not the same
right,
root.
and I will dwell within it,
So
right?
it's a place for God to dwell within it, within the people, a place of Makom Kadosh.
Good. So you actually said two different things, both of which are important. The first is God commanded it. Well, already, that's, to some degree, that's all the reason we kind of need. We like more. Right.
It says it over and over and over.
So we like to have more than that, but at a start, God commanded it. The second thing that you said, Diana, is, right, Vasuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, make for me a mikdash, a holy space. V'shachanti, mishkan and shachanti are the same word in Hebrew, and I will dwell amongst them. A mishkan is a place for God to dwell. Right? A mishkan is a place for God to dwell.
Well, this is a little more sociological, but the people of Israel had to spend 40 years in the desert. All this description of the Mishkan is very similar to the Ark of Egypt. And at least that's not my thing, that's somebody, a scholar,
Mhm.
said this. And in a sense, they were taking what they took out of Egypt, their sense of beauty and everything like that, and they were transforming it into something that wasn't Egyptian and that was related to God.
Nice. Nice. So they lived in Egypt for 400 years as slaves. They saw all of this beautiful art, all of this beautiful building that was there. And to some degree, they took that sense of beauty, that sense of the way that we show honor to gods in Egypt, and transformed it into the way that we show honor to God in the desert. Marge.
Kind of building on that, last time we talked about community and community coming, so they're coming to something to see that represents community.
Excellent. So Marge argues that it represents community, and I want us to actually look at the first verse of this week's Parsha, verse 21. Ele Pekude HaMishkan. These are it translates here as records. These are the commandments of the Mishkan. Mishkan HaEdut, Asher Pukad Al Pi Moshe. This is, they call it the tabernacle of the pact, right? Edut is, we talked about this last week. What is an Edah? A community, right? So one understanding is, this is the Mishkan of the community. Now, the grammar doesn't quite support that, right? It's the same word, but the grammar doesn't quite support that. An Edah is a community, but it's a community that witnesses. That's what we talked about last time, an Ed. So Mishkan HaEdut actually is the place, the tabernacle, that testifies, that witnesses. What does it witness? What does it witness? That's what we're going to get out of this week's Parsha, right? This is, by the way, the first place that it's called that. Mishkan Ha'edut, this is Pekude, it's a unique sort of framing of this. What does it mean to have a place that witnesses, a place that testifies? We know that. We talk about it in a lot of different ways. What is a place that testifies? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we know it today very often as a memorial, right? We go to Washington, D.C., and we see, the wall from Vietnam. Like, that is a place that testifies to the sacrifice, to all of that, right? It is a place that tells a story. Any of these memorials that we have, and today, unfortunately, it's very often in a memorial, but it doesn't have to be. Right? There could be places that testify. I mean, I guess you could argue the Eiffel Tower is a place that testifies. It testifies to the history and the city of Paris, right? It's a place that is known, and when you see that, that's what you understand. That's what you remember. So, how is our Mishkan a place that testifies? Michal? Right. Right. Wherever we go, we take this with us, and it is something that is concrete. We know that we need something concrete. We saw that in the whole golden calf incident that we read a number of weeks ago. Human beings like to see something tangible. We obviously don't want to make a concretized form of God. We're not allowed to do that, but we can make a concretized place where we say, this is where we're going to go to engage, to interact with God. Right? This is where we're going to go. What's another great example of what we do and the way we do that? Again, it's more in the memorial type of place, but it's a headstone, right? Going to a cemetery and having a headstone there, we theologically, philosophically believe that person is no longer there, and yet that's a concrete place that we can go to remember, to engage with that person.
I like your example better, the one of the cemetery, the Matzeva, where you're doing an action a little better than like the Eiffel Tower, I think, because the Eiffel, I don't, it doesn't have like a soul, like there's no like spirit, like there's this whole idea of like tzimtzum and in the Mishkan where God's like contracting and he's there and he's not there. But what comes to mind like when I hear of like testament or testimony or edut, I think of the Great Gatsby and the billboard with the glasses from the eye doctor who's like always watching. And I don't know why I always think about that. So there's this sense that like you're being watched, and it's like your relationship with God, your relationship with yourself, you're doing the right thing with other people, your responsibility, that if your job was to be one of the wise women weavers, shout out to women, that they were doing everything exactly Asher Tzivah Hashem et Moshe.
Right. So look, it's a way to remind us of God's presence, right? We translate that today into different ways, right? How is that translated? It's translated into kippah, mezuzah, tefillin, right? Those are things that we use to remind us of our relationship with God, to remind us of God's presence. I mean, to a very real degree. I mean, I wear a kippah all the time. I have that symbol, that sign of God's presence, that reminder, right? It makes me think all the time. How am I acting? How am I behaving? How are people perceiving me, especially in today's day and age, right? When I don't know, people are going to say, oh, that Jew. Well, what do I want them to say after that, right? It reminds me, it forces me to think about how I behave, and I could imagine that having this Mishkan literally in the center of the community was that reminder, to say nothing of, the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud and the fact that, all of those visible reminders that are there as well. So you mentioned something interesting, and Diana, one of the things that Rabbi Sacks speaks about in his life-changing ideas book, he actually draws, and I'd never heard this before until I read Rabbi Sacks, he draws a parallel between the verses that talk about the Mishkan that we have here in our Parsha and the verses back in Genesis, right? There's this creation story that's going on. And he talks about in Genesis says, and God saw all that God had made, and behold, it was very good. And if you look at verse 39:43, it says, Moses saw all the skilled work, and behold, they had done it as God had commanded it. Right? Those same verses, or the same verbs of saw and behold. We also have back in Genesis, and the heaven and earth and all of their array were completed. Here we have, and all of the work of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting was completed. And there's this whole series of parallels that Rabbi Sacks talks about in terms of creation of the universe and creation of the Mishkan. And he actually, and he doesn't usually speak in a mystical way, but he ties it into the fact that so in Genesis, the universe or the days of the week are divided into two, right? Into Kodesh and Chol. Kodesh is holy, that's Shabbat. Chol is the rest of the week, right? And in a sense, when God created the universe, there's another layer of withdrawing God's self that we don't often talk about. And this is the brilliance, I think, of what Rabbi Sacks taught. It's not just that God created God's self so that we could exist, but out of the 7 days of the week, 6 are Chol and 1 is Kodesh. In essence, God withdrew God's self from those 6 days of the week so that we could do all the things that we need to do in this world. And that 1 day a week, Shabbat, That is the day that God's presence is felt in a very different way. Now, of course, that doesn't mean we can't bring God into the rest of the week. But God is limiting God's self to say, look, I get it. You have to go and you have to make a living and you have to do all these sorts of things. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just sit and commune with one another and connect with one another all the time? It doesn't work that way, right? You have to live in the real world. You have to go out and you have to make a living and you have to get food and you have to build your houses and you have to do all those sorts of things. So God is saying, I'm going to let you do that. I'm going to limit myself and let you do that. But one day a week that you're mine. One day a week, it's the other way around. We limit ourselves so that we can be with God.
I think what's also very amazing that just ties the whole thing together is we have the story of creation where God worked for 6 days. On the seventh day, God rested. Now we're fast forward to the building of the Mishkan. And then what are we not allowed to do on Shabbat? Any of the building that was done for the Mishkan.
Right.
And that's what ties it together. Like, and the 39 come from Elu HaDvarim, or Elu is 30, has the 39.
Right.
But anyway,
So
that's what's like amazing how it all
absolutely. The very things that we are prohibited from doing on Shabbat base themselves on the creation of the Mishkan, right? But it's this relationship back and forth. And that, by the way, I think is why it is called Mishkan HaEdut. The Mishkan of that testimony, or of the pact, right? Of the relationship between us and between God. It reminds us in both a positive and a negative sort of way of when we need to engage in our world and when we need to engage in God's world. And to make space for that. If we don't make space for it in the same way that God made space for us, then God won't exist. We've talked about this when we sing the song, Va'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, right? Build for me a sanctuary and I will dwell among them or within them. The Hebrew is a little ambiguous. And so, b'tocham can mean inside of them, literally within them, or it can mean amongst them. Either way. So, b'tocham, if we don't create that space in ourselves and our lives, then God's presence isn't going to be there. And that's how the book of Exodus ends. Right? We've gone through the absence of God. We've gone through God now imposing God's self on Egypt and on us at Mount Sinai. We've gone the back and forth of us not being good stewards of God's commandments and the ramifications of that. We've built this place, and now it ends by saying, it's up to us, right? At this point in time, it's on us. Are we going to allow this relationship to continue? It's not on God anymore. Any comments before we go into our reading? Barbara.
You kind of pointed out a differentiation between doing your work in the week and then having, a day that's focused on God. But there are people, how do you explain, like the ultra-Orthodox in Israel, who are just praying, every single day, not working, and that's all they do.
Well, look, first of all, it's not everybody, but they also make a differentiation between the things that they do on Shabbat and not on Shabbat, right? Yes, they're dedicating their lives to study, to growth, but they do other things as well that they wouldn't do on Shabbat. So in their mind, they're also making that differentiation. It's different from us. It's different from the way that we look at the world, clearly, but they're making that differentiation as well. Anybody else? Last minute questions before we actually read our Torah portion. All right. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Let's begin.